note that this will be a very brief introduction, and so please do contact me with any follow-up questions, and a rough transcript for this talk is up at disabledstudents.co.uk/transcript. There will be some interactive sections, and so that transcript will be updated to add that in. So firstly, let's start with why you should engage with the topic and start with some stats. So in 2019-20, there was 332,200 students, sorry, not good at maths, who declared a disability. And this is the equivalent of 17.3% of all home students. However, despite a steady increase in student numbers, only 21.6% of disabled people have a degree in comparison to 38% of non-disabled people. It is important to note that when we talk about numbers of disabled students, we're only talking about the numbers that have declared. Due to the stigma around disability and the lack of information and awareness that people have about what disability is, it is very likely that there are far more students in higher education that could define as disabled. However, even at current numbers, disability is the largest minority group, and so there is a solid statistical basis for engaging in this topic. Also in the presentation, there is details of all these statistics, so please do look them up after the talk. So where do we start with this topic? This is not an easy question, considering the competing priorities that student unions are facing. When NSS scores are dire, there are officer manifestos to action, and we are still in a pandemic. The idea of embarking on a potentially big, complicated, and scary topic area can be overwhelming. This is not helped by the lack of knowledge and data in this area, and as I have said, disability is complex and there's often no specific data for local institutions, and disabled students are classically hard to reach. If you are still, sorry, I think I've missed a bit on my last slide, so I'm just going to double check. No, I haven't, it's just me. So where did I get to? Yeah, if you are still ready to take on all these challenges, the next question is disability work actually attainable? Do people actually care about the topic? Are they going to be invested? And is the funding available for the resourcing and change that requires? The answer to these questions will vary from institution to institution. This is going to be a common theme, but disability is complex. This is one of the many drivers of the fear in getting familiar with this topic. However, disability is everywhere. So embrace the fear and embrace the complexity. Yes, this is going to be difficult. You will meet resistance and sometimes you may not get it right. But disability is an intersectional status with many students emerging as disabled people through their time at university, meaning that changes implemented for disabled students actually have a net positive effect on the rest of the student population. No one has ever complained about increased accessibility. Lecture capture, lists, and even text messaging was originally designed for the disabled community, but are now open to all. So when we're talking about the complexity and how to approach this kind of topic, I was just going to ask people in the room if they could put in the chat an issue that you face, so an issue that's on your current SU agenda in your role to talk about. It doesn't have to be about disability. In fact, don't think about disability for this part of the talk, but something that maybe you're kind of doing an ongoing project on, or you're thinking about planning, stick it in the chat, and then we'll discuss how this will link potentially to this issue. Cool, I'll wait till I have a few more. And also I talk really fast, so apologies, I'm from the north of England. I will try and slow down for the people trying to keep up with me. Oh, really interesting things coming through. So I'll start, please do kind of keep going. So increasing engagement, yeah, this is a classic one. So disabled students are notoriously hard to reach, and sometimes engagement can be structural, environmental, or in fact cultural. So there's a lot of things around engagement that disability links into. The introduction of an online booking system for advice centres is an interesting one. So in terms of online accessibility, things like making it accessible to online screen readers for different students with different impairments is really important, especially if it's on an online platform. What we've seen with the lecture capture, for example, is that even though it's kind of touted as this accessibility kind of platform, the platform itself isn't always accessible, which is not always great. So yeah, and then what else is there? So I'm just scrolling. Yeah, so reconstructing our part-time office structure. Thank you for this. Massive passion of mine is DSOs. So yeah, so I think some of this I'm going to touch on later in the talk, but around if you only have one disabled students officer, for example, to represent what could be 2,000 or 3,000 students, as I will comment later, is a recipe for burnout. And so having a structure that potentially has a committee structure with so that students can like lighten the load and actually build a sense of community is actually really important. But actually not just the part-time officer structure, but how that links into your full-time officer structure as well, so that those part-time officers have quite a lot of support that they need. Housing fair, so this could be a whole hour talk, and as a welfare and liberation officer, this is my jam. But housing affairs are good, and the actual accessibility to them as an event is one issue, but also the dire straits of the housing sector and how little adapted accommodation there is. But also in terms of advertising university halls, a lot of the time adapted accommodation or disability suitable accommodation, I should say, is in the most expensive part of those halls, is on the ground floor, and normally is only available to first year students, meaning that often disabled second, third and fourth years are not placed with their peers, and that increases a lot of isolation. I'm going to go through a few more. Oh, accessibility audits. Awesome. Sorry, I'm getting very excited for all these projects. So yeah, I think in terms of accessibility, inclusivity and participation, some of the models I'm going to explain later on in this talk about how you can kind of tackle some of these things in terms of disability. So whether you do it as a standalone project or something that's more embedded for that might be quite useful for you. Also, great stuff that there's a recently introduced student committee to support the DSO. Yeah, with this, there's the caveat of kind of disability politics that I won't go into in this talk, but it's really important to kind of give a space for those relationships to form, that it's not the DSO is the top of the tree and the committee is kind of a secondary level, but actually they're working together. Collaboratively is really important, but also just the idea that disabled students have a very specific experience through higher education, and having that opportunity to share that experience and have that support of other disabled students is really important on a personal level as well. Also, having been a DSO and having to coordinate an exec of up to 8 with differing access requirements, cultural backgrounds, ideas, thoughts, and everything else is a challenge in leadership in and of itself, which is fun, but also is something that I don't think gets a lot of recognition in terms of disability organising in particular. Yeah, and so what I would say on committees is if you do have one, what's really helpful and what DSOs are calling for currently is for those committees nationally to be more joined up. So having a way of contacting other kind of committees if you're in a kind of big city environment, potentially getting some of events together. But yeah, so these are just some of the things like I've kind of alluded to, kind of disability is everywhere, and so sometimes it's actually easier to go into the projects you already have and go, how does this connect with disability, rather than going into the space going, how do I deal with disability as a thing? Because like I said, it is very complex, and I wouldn't recommend students try and do everything at once, because yeah, just no. Like small steps kind of in combination with what you already have is a really good first step and gives your staff chance to kind of get comfortable with some of this stuff as well. Yeah, so another thing, it's really good to have like co-presidents or split roles so that that kind of work sharing can go on. For some disabled people, they have quite stable conditions. For others, like the stress of exams or other key points can kind of exacerbate health issues. And so having multiple people to hand over to so that committee structure and that work is still continuing through those busy periods is really important. Um, and I would say on that, just as a thing, like I know there tends to be this feeling that if you bring too many people into a committee or too many people into the room, it takes away your power. I would argue against that quite vividly, of actually your power is your own, and bringing other student leaders into that room is probably going to help you rather than hurt you. So the idea that you have to concentrate power in very specific places is something that we might want to have a think about. So I think it's slowing down, and I'm going to head back to the, hopefully the good stuff. Let me just reshare my screen a second. And hopefully I'm not sharing everything, but we can, I have a lot of windows open, so excuse me. I'm gonna move that down over here. Calls. And let me know if anyone can't see this okay. There's also captions, sorry, I should have said on, so if there's anything that kind of gets covered up by the captions, just holler. So now we've kind of discussed some of the issues that are within your role. The question now becomes, how do you approach a disability issue? Now, again, with anything complex, the methodology is going to depend on what you are actually approaching. I'm going to talk about two approaches you could use for different topics as an example of some of the methodology that is available. Firstly, approaching the issue as a discrete disability project. This is something that you're probably most familiar with, setting up a commission or a research group or a working group on disability as an all-encompassing singular topic, investigating how this is affecting students and what to do about it. This can be a great way of getting starting data for your institution. However, it also requires a certain amount of specific targeting to make this work really well. So if you're looking at specific policies such as lecture capture, extenuating circumstances, or housing provision within halls, this is something of a siloed approach and can be useful in the short to medium term, but when things get complicated, more limitations tend to appear. A slightly more radical alternative, what I'm calling considered embedding, is the approach that can be applied to any existing agenda and is incredibly flexible. It involves looking at your existing agenda and considering the impacts those issues may have on disabled students. For example, you may already have a housing project or a housing campaign that would mean considering how disability fits into that issue. This can look a bit more complicated, but I think in the long run actually takes up less resource and can be used a lot more flexibly, meaning that you can tackle multiple issues within your agenda and practice ways of thinking that starts to automatically embed and consider disability, which in itself will create a bigger knowledge base and can help you form more consistent feedback. It does take a longer time investment, but I think it's a more holistic way of approaching it and means you don't have to set up specific disability projects. It may even take some of the fear out of the whole concept as you are considering disability within issues that you're already familiar with. And so the learning curve on this can be less daunting. However, as I have said, it depends on what you are approaching and what data you have. There's nothing wrong with mixing approaches and approaching things in the best way for you and your local environment. So hopefully in discussing some of the things we discussed in the last slide, it will give you some idea of the different ways in which you could possibly approach this stuff. So we've looked at the issues quite broadly, so let's look at a more measured way of starting to deconstruct some of these issues. There are a lot of different models of disability and none of them truly encompasses the whole experience. However, I have highlighted two of the probably most commonly used in higher education, and it may be argued that those that have the biggest contrast. So, the medical model of disability is predicated on the fact that a person has a functional deficit that can be diagnosed by a professional of some description, and then this deficit is evidenced. This model can be reductive and attaches a lot of negative connotations with disability, as well as putting an individual focus on the problem. So, in my case, as a wheelchair user, because my legs do not work properly or as other people's do, this problem that I need a wheelchair for, and this is a problem that I therefore need a wheelchair for, and therefore creates an access barrier because I cannot walk on my two legs. This model is often demarked by the need for evidence, diagnosis, and ultimately proof of a deficit or negative aspect that needs to be fixed. In comparison, however, the social model of disability was coined by members of the disabled community and states that instead of the individual being disabled by the problem, the actual issue is the lack of universal design within our society. Therefore, it is not a wheelchairs users' lack of mobility that is the issue, but in fact, the lack of facilities such as lifts to enable their access. The social model sets out that an individual's impairments, conditions, and disability in themselves are not a problem, but the way society reacts to them is. Such as creating barriers, limiting access, this model therefore has a more societal focus and a less individual one, meaning that disclosure and stigma is reduced. Interestingly, most universities have some form of declaration that they adhere to the social model of disability, when in fact a lot of their procedures and policies are actually predicated on the medical model of disability. So being able to identify which model of disabilities are underpinning certain policies at your institution can be really helpful in unpicking them and not only finding solutions, but strategizing how changes to them could be perceived. So, to kind of move into our second section of this talk about kind of horizon scanning, winter is coming is the shortest way of putting this. This presentation has been hastily edited as we now know that the NSS scores across the sector are frankly dire. However, what is interesting is that the differential between the NSS scores between those who have declared a disability and those who have not are even worse. This is going to have a massive impact on the provision for online teaching next year. And as a lot of the accessibility that was gained through pandemic intervention, there is a lot of universities that have been touting this as increased disability access, but this was not implemented for disabled people, but more rather for the largest student body. This means that disabled students are increasingly vulnerable, not knowing what continued accessibility will still exist in September. And it has to be noted that there's an increasing kind of lobby, or at least a lot of loud student voice really wanting to return to normal. So brings me to Freedom Day, but freedom for who? I think it's fair to say that the OFS guidance past Freedom Day can be summed up as telling the universities to do it themselves. This is an interesting point and a terrible prospect for disabled students, because even though the OFS has determined that universities need an outbreak plan, there is currently no plan or strategic plan for how they're going to deliver parity in education for students that are clinically vulnerable in particular. Disability declarations tend to only happen within higher education when a person's disability directly affects their ability to learn, process information, or basically do something that has a direct connection to their academic work. In the pandemic, however, we're seeing that clinically vulnerable students or people extends much further than that, and anecdotal evidence is starting to show that cohorts of individuals, such as those that have undergone cancer treatment or transplant recipients, may not have any immunity to the virus despite being doubly vaccinated. This is why I personally believe that universities are not going to be prepared for or have the feedback mechanisms or even the awareness to ask students pertinent questions about their health. Imagine being a cancer survivor or having a transplant. You're not necessarily going to want to or believe it's relevant to declare that to your university. This kind of gulf in terms of what the universities can and are prepared for is really, really worrying when we go into next year, given that the government now has very little safeguards in place, like outside of the higher education sector. So finally on this, in terms of specific support, it brings me to DSA cuts. Sorry to break this to you if you're not familiar with the sector, but DSA, Disabled Students Allowance, from next year is going to have a new lowered cap, which, while excluding travel expenses, does mean that disabled students with the highest support needs stand to lose out the most. These cuts have been coming for a while, but in conjunction with the individual caps, there is also changed how provision is going to be assessed by a completely cost-driven metric with no consideration of quality assurance. This is a further cut to the sector over the last couple of years that's seen a reduction in providers, specifically nationwide, from about 400 to what is currently around 10, depending on your area and depending on the type of provision that you're looking at. This means that there is less choice for students, and there is a real slowdown in standards and the real potential that universities are going to need to cover the shortfall at a time when financial budgets are tight and disabled students are seen more and more as a problem, a headache that universities simply do not want to deal with. There is currently no mechanism to resolve issues of poor support provision for either staff or students, which means that there's going to be little recourse in how students face issues to do with or integrated with disabled students allowance. So, with all that dark, terrible news, I bring you some final slides that will hopefully bring a little light into this dark, dark cave we find ourselves in. Firstly, as my colleague Meta has said earlier this week, disabled students are the experts in this area. They know the local landscape and the policies better than most people in the university. Mixed with the fact that they are often taking this journey along with everybody else, it's really important that this knowledge is respected, the labour it takes is compensated, and probably most importantly, that there is an understanding that when disabled students complain, it is not coming from a place of anger or criticism, but a place of frustration, distress, and isolation. It is really important that you reflect on your internal structures and processes to see if there are any internal improvements you can make to the support and integration of disability. For example, if you have a structure that only has one part-time officer, you have a recipe for guaranteed burnout. Most disabled officers deal with a couple of thousand students, and this will differ according to the needs and total student population of your institution. But they do this with very little support. This is on top of managing their own disability health needs and the administrative burden that comes with that. Therefore, it is imperative that where possible, disabled student committees are formed to share the load and that there is a clear feedback both in and out of the union in the ways that disabled students can be supported by officers and staff, and that all of this is moving forward in the same direction. Sadly, this takes me on to resources. Properly resourced disability and especially support of disabled students will take staff support, an audit of internal knowledge, awareness of where you can obtain that knowledge from, and a realistic approach to student union backing. The greatest barrier to disabled students' officers across the sector is that they feel alone, unsupported, and often in opposition to their student unions as well as their universities. This is often because of the complex nature and fear that often comes with dealing with disability issues. In this final knowledge slide, I wanted to go through a framework that I am developing at Disabled Students UK in relation to how to apply a step-by-step approach to dealing with these issues. Step number 1, C. Identify the model that is underpinning the policy or issue you are trying to approach. This will help you assess the best methodology and approach to strategize with the university or institution and see how they could respond and what your potential resistance to that could be. It also informs the bigger culture at your institution. Step 2, partner with your DSOs and disabled students. The use of partnership is intentional. This partnership should be open without judgment, and where criticism is raised, it should be seen in the context of frustration, isolation, and the individual impact that disability discrimination has on students. This can be a really hard conversation, and you may hear things that you don't want to hear, but it's really important that disabled students have a platform, a space, and have their voices heard. They are the experts in this area, and so a lot of the time they will not only bring you the issues, but help you produce potential solutions to them. Step 3. Probably the most important part of this model is continued collaboration with disabled students. So rather than having an extractive model of taking what disabled students say and then kind of leaving them at the door while other people action it, keep them on side and involved in the process. Often initial ideas, even when they are signed off, tend to run into problems that can only really be seen by disabled students throughout the implementation phase. So by having a long-term, measured and integrated partnership with your disabled students and disabled students officers, you can share that community knowledge in a way that creates a true solution to the problem. And my final slide, because I've ran, so apologies if anyone needs me to repeat anything, is I just wanted to make you aware that as Network Director, I'm embarking in an SU Charter project this summer, creating a disability-specific charter to build inclusive structures, knowledge, and confidence within SUs. The consultation stage with SU stakeholders is very soon to begin, and this charter will hopefully bring together a framework to aid action plans, knowledge acquisition, and best practice in terms of supporting disabled students going forward. The content is informed by disabled students' experiences from across the UK, and if you are interested in this, please email contact@disabledstudents.co.uk or interact with us on Twitter @ChangeDisabled. We also have an officer workshop being put on at NUS Lead and Change in both week 1 and week 2, but I will stop sharing my screen now and take a breath in case anyone has any questions. Again, I'm perfectly happy to repeat anything I ran at like 50,000 miles per hour through that presentation.
I've got one question, but it might not be directly related to this.
No, go ahead.
Hi, Thomas Watson, Student Voice Coordinator at Swansea. We've had some really good DSOs in the last couple of years, and we're setting up a committee for us to be able to, as you said, represent the wide variety of students that we've got. But one stumbling block we're getting to is we're gathering things like that. We've done accessibility reports and stuff around campus, pointing out issues where there's cracked paving slabs, etc., etc. We've taken it to senior management. We've done that, and it's still not being done. And I just kind of wanted to ask, is there any? Yeah, sorry, classic estates. Yeah. But is there I just want more of like ammunition in terms of, is there someone that I can go, look, we're going to get X, Y, Z involved? Because it's years and years and years now of us just kind of saying it and saying it and saying it. How would you advise us in terms of?
I think one of the things I learned being DSO and sabbatical officers, when it comes to these things, you need to go kind of the next level up. Like the buy-in, if possible, from senior management to kind of be able to kind of skip that level of resistance is really, really helpful. Although I think in order to get that kind of senior management buy-in, you'd have to go with a kind of bigger portfolio of this is your problem in order to be able to get the leverage you would need for a specific issue like estates. Because I think, one, it's a health and safety issue, and universities love discussing health and safety till it comes out their ears. So there's always that methodology, but I think it's just about having as much flexibility within your lobbying as possible. And obviously that's different from institution to institution. The kind of, if you can get it, go from the top down, because then you get put on committees that when things are being implemented and you kind of stop these issues from happening, and having a kind of good relationship with the estates. I know kind of I had this problem as DSO, and it turned out that the estates department just didn't have any staff because all of them had been sacked or like moved on over the summer, and this was happening on a quite frequent basis. And so that was like the stumbling block. By the time all the paperwork had been completed to do the work, there was actually no one in the office to do the work. And so kind of understanding the kind of challenges within your institution is also really helpful to be able to kind of suggest things and even kind of help them implement them sometimes. I mean, it is frustrating when you have to do quite a lot of the work yourself, but I think it kind of helps build those relationships with certain departments that you're probably going to be in contact with quite a lot on these kind of issues, because infrastructure is a massive problem in higher education. Like for me, I was in a university in the north, and snow was our biggest problem, and grit, because they never used to grit the disabled parking, for example, or where people were dropped off, which was incredibly dangerous. But they just never thought to, because the general population didn't kind of interact with that part of campus. So I think it's kind of showing them, this is how your students are interacting. This is the risk it is to you. If someone falls over that broken pavement and breaks their ankle, they can sue you. Obviously, you don't want to go straight to the suing legal argument, but reminding them that it's the potential court case is also helpful. So yeah, I mean, it's just very much depends on your kind of university structure to what the best method is. And I'm more than happy if you want to drop me an email to kind of talk about it a bit more, like specifically as well, if that helps.
Thank you very much.
Let me just scroll up. Yeah, it's a really interesting question in the chat about disabled student movements campaigning, and the understanding of disability to include those with chronic illness, mental health, and other hidden disabilities. I think there has been progress within the movement and within the disability circles, but there hasn't been on the outside. And what we find is disabled people are often not born or provided with a handbook of how this stuff works or who they can connect with. And so it's more the kind of stigma that you're kind of indoctrinated with before you get to the point of discovering you have that hidden disability, or coming to terms with the kind of even being comfortable telling people you are disabled, or even telling yourself that you are disabled. So I think that is where a lot of education needs to come in, and actually a lot of unpicking of some of these kind of structures and things that we're kind of taught at a very kind of fundamental level. And so Meta, my colleague, has also put some really useful things in the chat. If people like to read things about OIA, complaints procedures, and our monthly events for disabled students officers that we run. The next one will be in September, but again, if anyone wants to contact us, we can send out all the information for the stuff that's happening. And I think I have like 3 or 4 more minutes if anyone has any more questions. Literally can be anything, don't mind.
I think we've gone quiet on the questions, haven't we? I mean, it was a really great presentation, lots of information in there, and you know, some practical tips and things that people can consider when moving forward to support students more effectively. So thank you very much, Amelia, for sharing that with us all. If there are any questions that people do have you got an email address that you can share? And just
so it's contact@disablestudents.co.uk, and from the look of my colleague's face, she's typing like the wind, so thank you for that. It's also, we have Twitter @ChangeDisabled. So if you want to follow us on Twitter, you can kind of follow all our kind of policy developments and stuff that we're doing over the summer as well. But yeah, we also provide kind of bespoke paid services and consulting to SUs. So if this is something that is truly terrifying and you're like, please help us, we are more than happy to do that. And we also have a program of kind of pairing and integrating and kind of smoothing the relationships between local disabled students and DSOs and SUs or their universities, so that when we kind of part ways, you also have a structure that can kind of follow on from that work that works for you in particular.
Fantastic, thank you so much for that. So if there are no questions, I think this is the first and only session of the week to have finished this early, so thank you very much.
I mean, just the absolute skill of being able to talk at speed, I think, is that. So apologies. Brilliant. If you missed half of it, it is recorded. I apologize that I'm from the north.
Yeah, no, amazing quality, thank you. But yes, it is being recorded, so you should be able to get some details quite soon as to how you can look back over this session and any of the sessions that you've either attended or have occurred throughout the week. Because I know the few sessions that I've kind of hosted have been absolutely fantastic, and I definitely will be using them as a resource moving forward. But if there is nothing else and individuals don't have any further questions, I would suggest that you enjoy the sunshine as long as it may last. We are supposed to have a glorious weekend, so please enjoy the rest of today's activities and the conference, and hopefully we will see each other and be in the same spaces again quite soon. Enjoy, and thank you very much for joining us.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Big thanks again to Amelia.